What's a small town dark secret you know? An extremely wealthy grandma had an affair with a pool boy. He called it quits and she accidentally ran him over and killed him. I don't remember if she actually caught her charge for it, but she didn't do any time. The family knows it was deliberate. Talks about it nonchalantly like, "Don't piss grandma off. She ran over the last man that crossed her." Edit, grammar. When I was a firefighter we had an arsonist in the city. They would walk around at night until they found a garage door that was left open. And then they'd start a fire in the garage. It did not matter if the residents were home or not. We had no leads other than it was a college student, as there was a discernible pattern of the fire stopping during winter and summer breaks. The police, fire department, and the highest levels of local government worked to keep the nature of fires a secret as they were worried about how it would impact the town's image. So, instead of telling people to close their ducking garage doors at night, nearly 20 families lost their homes. The arsonist was never caught, and presumably is still lighting fires in some other town. Growing up, our mayor had 2 teenage children and a baby. It was common knowledge the baby was the offspring of his 2 kids. It was just one of those things people didn't talk about. After he left office, his daughter gave birth to a kid by him as well. And no, I did not grow up in Alabama. Small UK town. Man taken to hospital. Dies on arrival. Local news had announced that police were looking to speak to witnesses. Then announced police have upgraded it to a murder investigation. A few days later, some guys are arrested in connection to the case. A couple of months pass and they are sentenced to prison for murder. That's all that was made public. Heard through some friends who have family working at the local hospital that the victim had power drill inflicted injuries to every joint in his body. Grapevine says he'd sexually assaulted the underage daughter of one of the guys who then murdered him. A kebab shop in my hometown has an underground casino and sells food at the back door after closing hours. There's an unexploded nuclear warhead or hydrogen bomb in a swamp 30 miles from here. And it's been here since the 1960s. Always a crazy rumor until the DOD confirmed it in 2012. Apparently every now and again they come and look for it. It's in Goldsboro, North Carolina. They recovered most of it. Only one new core remains. It's 200 foot deep. My hometown has a famous drug addict, that is, everyone knows who he is. He's lived there for 70 years and his crimes are town gossip. Most of the time it's small stuff, stolen bikes, and once a canoe, that he just leaves somewhere. Living in a park when he doesn't feel like going home for a few days. Shit like that. He's mostly seen as a harmless, funny character. His brain is seriously damaged after hard drug use since his early teens. What is rarely mentioned is that when he still had a house he used to steal dogs and beat them to death in his basement. There are these old abandoned mines, as in mineral mines, think man-made caves in the side of a mountain, near my hometown town where kids used to go to smoke weed and make out before they put metal gates over them. When I was in high school there was this huge thing where a cop went missing. Car and all. While he was on duty. He just didn't show up at shift change. This was before GPS and smartphones etc. People thought he'd been killed by gang members or something. There were no gangs in the town but everyone was convinced that they came down from the nearest big city to do crimes. Eventually they announced they found him. Accidental death. Very sad. Wife and young kids etc. What wasn't in the news? But everyone knew through word of mouth. He and another cop's wife were having an affair and they were found in his patrol car in one of the McKeown mines. Dead of carbon monoxide poisoning. Our local cinema owner would cut out dirty scenes back when movies came on film rolls. For decades. All those butter jokes about Last Tango in Paris went over my head. We didn't catch on until Phoebe Cates' bare titties were conspicuously missing from our cut of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. My small town priest moved parishes to my church a few years ago. Seemed normally there. Not until a few months ago when we found out he was sleeping with a married woman from the new parish he was at. The woman had kids that attend the school and her husband eventually found out. Called the church. And he was basically vanished. Found out recently he moved from his first parish because he was sleeping around with parishioners there as well. But they wanted to keep it low key, so they just switched his parish. A few months ago there was a brief media kerfuffle in the local papers about someone breaking into a barn and attacking a pony. The account that made it to the papers tactfully omitted the fact that by attack they mean sexual assault. I learned this via a Facebook post shared by a classmate of mine who was friends with the owners of the horse. Edit. I'm not specifying exactly where this took place beyond somewhere in the East Midlands, England. Popular pediatric orthodontist is in jail now for having sex with his high school young college-aged employees in exchange for painkillers and nitrous. And when it came out, he admitted to being high while doing surgery most of the time. So this guy was taking turns on the nitrous tank while taking out my 4 impacted wisdom teeth. But he knows some people. So that story went away very quickly. In my town everyone thought that the elementary school music teacher was a pedophile. And a few years ago he got arrested. The school never told us what he got arrested for. But everyone knew what it was for. Turns out he was looking up child porn on the school computers. A guy jumped off a really tall building in my hometown. Ruled a suicide. But rumor has it that he was forced to jump. Or physically thrown off the building. Due to his dealings with organized crime. That's how mafia work. In my hometown, a girl in her mid-20s was seeing an older man. Most of the town bullied her so much that she eventually killed herself. Only a few people showed up to the funeral. Most of her family didn't even turn up, due to either shame or ignorance. Village next to my town. A stable is found with a dozen dead cows and more barely alive. Standing in a literal meter of their own excrement. Neighbors claimed that they didn't notice anything. That the farmer didn't seem unusual. But I heard that they all knew that he was completely neglecting these animals. That he was an alcoholic and that he threatened his neighbors to set their farms on fire if they dared to report anything. The surviving cows are okay now and were taken away from him. I was dating this girl from rural Maine. I mean really ducking rural. Western Maine near the Appalachian Trail. I'm hanging out with her family one summer shooting gums. Shotgunning sheety beer. And sharing hunting stories. One of the guys there starts talking about how he likes to hunt hikers on the trail. He'll even take pot shots with his rifle. Ducking up their campsites at night. That kind of shit. He also claimed he came across this older woman camping a bit off the trail. Raped her. Made her write some fake note about how she starved. Then killed her. The other guys were laughing and backslapping him while I sat there drunk as duck and in total disbelief. I hope he was just bulleting, but at the time I was glad I had a shotgun in my lap. Never hike alone in rural Maine. In my best Robert Stack voice update, I've contacted the Maine State Police and gave them all the info I had. They said they'd look into it. If anyone lives in Maine, keep an eye on the news and you might see something in the coming weeks. When I was in middle school, there were a series of arson fires near my very small Pennsylvania town. The last one burned up a mother and her daughter. The mother was considered promiscuous. The daughter was the kid that all the other kids made fun of. Needless to say, the little dumb duck teenagers responsible were never found. In my small town, there's a former priest who had articles written about his abuses of children written about that were dealt with by the church and never handled by law enforcement. So he's not on any offender list. He lives really close to a school, too. Everyone knows. But he keeps to himself and is very old. Grocery store clerks have said he's very rude. In my mother's ex-town there is a box full of automatic weapon and grenade buried somewhere. My grandfather had been a partisan in Italy during WW2 and at the end of the war his unit, instead of handing arms to the government forces, decided to hide them in case the Soviets had invaded the country. Now he is dead and with him also the position of the box. The only other person besides me and my mother who knows about the box is the last men alive of his unit. I live in Bad Neuenahr, Germany, and Rex Tillerson once stayed here for a G7 conference. He resided in a local hotel which was directly above a series of tunnels that were dug there before WW1 in search of new geysers and well springs. My town is a therapeutic baths town. And people knew that you could basically move throughout the town undetected and they are not mapped anywhere. Since the plans got lost in a WW2 bombing raid, I believe. So tunnels basically. I live in a super small town, see all the same people constantly. And back in the 80s there was a group of guys my mom went to high school with who were rumored to have killed this poor old man in town and robbed his house blind of Drew Gus and nice belongings. They got away clean except for one of the idiots decided to shit in the sink. The police collected the sample, but at the time there wasn't the technology to find out who the sheet belonged to. Well, around 10-15 years later they finally had the technology and they tested that sample. They found out who it belonged to and the guy ended up in prison after getting away with it for so long. One of the local utility companies around me had some mysterious fires a while back. A bunch of paperwork and engineering plans went up in this fire. While the company was being investigated for mismanagement of funds and some of their newer facilities not being to the correct specs, it was ruled an accident. And they got an insurance payout. There was a male cop in our town who got fired for having sex with a woman in his patrol car. The secret was, it wasn't a woman. It was a man. The only reason I know of it is because the former cop is my fiance's uncle. There was a young lady with the last name Hussein who was murdered at the laundromat. It was many years ago and went unsolved. But there's a guy who everyone says has bragged about doing it. Disgusting. But with a town that is full of rednecks and has only 2 semi-retired cops, who's going to do anything? Back in the 80s they'd closed down the old middle school in my town and built a new one fairly close to it. Because the building wasn't that run down, they let the Little League, grades 2-6, teams practice in the old school and leave big kids alone at the new school. I'm not really sure how, but a rumor started that there was a Satanist club underneath the gym. People claimed they could hear chanting and loud banging noises from under the floor and it freaked everyone TF out, so the school mostly stopped using it. I found out the truth recently from my friend's mom. Apparently some locals ran a swingers club down there and she knew because went once just to see what it was like. They stopped after people started catching HIV. This was about 15 years ago in my pretty large country hometown. Me and my friends would always mess around in the woods that was near some fields. Just shooting off fireworks we stole from our parents or just playing with cans of Axe and lighters. One day luckily when I wasn't there things got out of hand and all the fields caught on fire. This is a farming town so a lot of these fields were connected and it soon rapidly spread to 50 acres of woods. On the upside the fire actually helped clear out some old brush and made the land more fertile to grow on. Canada. When the government opens crown land to cattle grazing, landowners have about a week to make sure their fences are good before the ranchers move their cattle. One wheat farmer in this small town didn't get to his fences in time. While fixing a fence, he got into an argument with a rancher whose cattle were on crown land and on his property eating his wheat. Turned violent. Rancher ended up with a broken leg and was left in the woods by the farmer. He drags himself to his vehicle and calls for help on his CB radio. Gets rescued. In the interim, the farmer confesses to his priest. Church decides to intervene. Church members convince the rancher and his family not to press charges. The church members become slave labor to the rancher while his leg heals. Meals. House cleaning. Repairs. Gardening. etc. This goes on for 3 or 4 months until the rancher is back on his feet. Freaks me out how far they will go to protect one of their own. A kid in my grade tried to rob an old lady. I think she was 98 years old and living by herself. After school one day he went to her house and broke in through the back door. Apparently she was going to be robbed without a fight and had a gun with her. As he went to disarm her the gun went off and broke a window. He got the gun away from her and strangled her to death. He started to panic and shoved her into a closet so no one would find her. A week or two later the neighbors called the police because something smelled horrible and the police arrived and found her body. I guess the kid went back and tried to make it easier to hide the body by cutting it up and placing the pieces all over the house. When the police finally recovered all the remains, the autopsy showed that she might have been raped. The kid just got a life sentence with no chance for parole. It's not exactly a dark secret in the same sense as most of these, because it's not a crazy scandal. But my town is one of those stereotypical yuppie suburban little Massachusetts towns. Expensive homes. Upper middle class. Pretty much 100% white. The usual for the area. And people are just starting to realize that it's full of heroin. Every single person I know knows at least 2 people who have overdosed and died. That's not an exaggeration. I know 2 myself who were close family friends. Plus another who died but was revived. It's sad as hell. My town started a campaign a while back to try to bring awareness to the epidemic. It seems like it's only getting worse. My town is not unique. There are so many of the same stories, small towns with a dark secret. The opioid crisis in New England is a scary, depressing thing. Edit, I was always aware that heroin was everywhere. I guess the emphasis on New England was more to say that around here. It seems like nobody thinks it could be so bad in such an idyllic and classy, read, mostly suburban, affluent and white, area. For those asking where I'm at, we'll just say Norfolk. Close enough. Not a dark secret. But this thread is getting too dark. My grandpa's favorite story was that he and a friend accidentally burnt down the town's ice house when they were 7. He always said that the town never knew. I was talking to one of his friends that grew up with him at my grandpa's funeral. When I told him the story he laughed and told me how it actually went down. The entire town knew what happened. However, due to their rage and the fact that my grandpa and his friend put out the fire, they weren't held accountable. Many years later my family found a newspaper detailing the event. TDLR, my grandpa thought that no one knew he burnt down an ice house. But the entire town knew and let him live with the guilt. High school teacher in a smallish southern town was known to be very friendly with the students. She was rumored to have sex with the older boys, but nothing ever happened. Until a couple years ago when a Snapchat video surfaced of the entire football team running a train on her. Family was burned alive when a house caught fire. Rumor has it, their daughter's boyfriend was jealous and set the house on fire. Neighbors heard their screams, but couldn't help. New guy moved to town, isolated, on a small island. He raped a local girl. Everyone knew, but there wasn't any hard evidence for the police to act on. The girl tried to kill herself, but failed. So, some of the town got together and brought the guy to the ferry pier. They pushed him off, and kept pushing him off until he drowned. No one was charged, and justice was served. Disclaimer, I was not involved in this. It happened when I was young. We have a scenic cliffside really close to town where a lot of dog walkers go. It has established paths and fences as well as a road running 10 m away from the edge. It's a hotspot for suicide, but I only found out about it from a Coast Guard friend while she was drunk that they are always on the lookout for bodies at the foot. She said about 10 on average were found a year, which is massive for our small town. It was surreal. BC, I had lived there my whole life and none were ever reported or anything. There were Samaritan organizations that did patrols every now and then, but they were fairly quiet about it. I had a friend who used to be very caring for everyone around in his life. He had a guy who used to be his classmate. They were kind of best friends. Once the guy was upset and didn't came to the class for more than a week. My friend called him up and asked him where the hell he is. The guy mentioned he was on the bank of river which flows through our city and was trying to commit suicide. My friend asked him to hold on. He took my bike keys and went to the guy to save his life, but he never returned. After 2 days of constantly searching for him, the police found his dead body on the bank of the same river. The case was closed as a suicide case. But I will tell you the truth. This was a foolproof plan. The guy and my friend were in love with the same girl. So the guy planned to call him up to the place and pushed him into the river. Unfortunately my friend didn't knew how to swim, so he drowned. We have proofs for what exactly happened and reopened the case, but we are just receiving the dates from the court, no judgment. And the guy is walking in the city like nothing ever happened. It's a true story and my friend was very close to me even. I do miss him a lot. But helpless we are with the system and government. Hope his soul rest in peace, praying. Not really a small town, Venice Beach, CA. Henry Hopper, Dennis Hopper's son. Great teenagers. It's known by everyone who knows him or of him. His friends look out for him and protect him when he's out partying, and they cover for him as best they can. Some believe they take part in their ring. He's been accused many times. Many calls to the police. Been arrested. He brags about it when he's drunk and brags about how he can't be stopped. It's LA and he's a D-list celebrity, child of an A-lister. The law is no match for his legal team and bottomless trust fund. One of our city councilwoman's kids are not her husband's. He has no idea. My parents lived next door to the family for years. They had 2 kids around the same age as my brother and I. They also had major marital problems but kept a good public facade. Husband was 30 years older than the wife. And had kids from a prior marriage. I guess one night, over way too much wine, councilwoman got some loose lips. She confessed to my mom that her husband didn't want kids. But she really wanted them. She didn't want to wait and get divorced, married again. So she went to a sperm bank, picked a donor that physically matched her husband, and did artificial insemination. Twice. Got pregnant both times. Told her husband that her pill must have failed. And claimed she didn't realize until it was too late to get an abortion. At the time she told this to my mom. The kids were 21 and 19. My mom didn't really know what to do. So she kinda kept her mouth shut until she blabbed to me several years later. Not mine. But my grandmother used to read coffee grinds for neighbors and friends, a form of fortune telling. She didn't believe in it. But it was a way to pass the time when she was a young mother back in the 50s, 60s. One day she was reading a neighbor's grinds and said, "Oh, strange. It says you have a baby." The neighbor, who was a single female in the same conservative immigrant community as my grandmother, got skittish and said my grandmother was wrong. My grandmother was like, "Honey, no. Look at this cup. That's a baby symbol," and her neighbor starts sobbing. Turns out, she had gotten pregnant as an older teenager, been sent away to have the kid, and ended up giving the baby away to a married friend who lived across the country. And now my grandmother was the only one in town who knew. She stopped reading cups for years after that one. Way too awkward. High school boy killed his sister while driving drunk out on farm roads. He became, essentially, the town pariah. But wouldn't leave the area. Worked at the local grocery store as a bagger. Never did move up. Nobody ever acknowledged him other than to give him dirty looks. Even years later. I don't remember anyone ever actually discussing why everyone hated him. But we all seem to know anyway. Even the newcomers. Not much of a secret as it hit the news, but probably not known outside Nova Scotia. About 10 years ago a little girl went missing and her mother reported it. Even going on the news asking for her daughter to return. A week or so later her body was found and the whole town mourned. Leaving teddy bears where her body was found. It was discovered that the mother murdered her because she didn't want her new BF to leave her as he didn't want kids. I was living in a different province during the time, but when I came back that was all people were talking about. I remember the cover of the local paper having an article about it saying the girl pleaded with her mother to stop before she was smothered with a pillow. Edit. I just googled and she was actually strangled and the mom was back in court just last year.